Kuzampo, you're watching Tungso Bibis, and I'm your host, Tashidema. On this episode, we'll be talking about child psychiatry, and I have Dr. Brent Waters here with me, who is here in Bhutan through the Health Volunteers Overseas Program. Thank you for being here with us, Doctor.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
It seems that child psychiatry is a relatively new topic, even in the field of medicine, and you have over a few decades of experience in this field. So can you tell us something about child psychiatry?
Child psychiatry is always a thing which develops later in the development of health services. It's partly because it's not seen as being a priority area. So for instance, in the area of mental health, they always start off with an adult psychiatry service, drug and alcohol service, exactly the same as happened in Bhutan. And the same thing has happened in Australia quite some time ago. It really wasn't until about 40 or 50 years ago in Australia that child psychiatry started to have any profile at all. And for a long time we had a lot of difficulties with funding. I think the reason is that people don't recognise stress and other problems in children. They just think it's part of normal childhood. But particularly in societies where modernisation is happening very quickly, some children get very, very high levels of stress, and there are often very simple things that can be done to help them.
It seems that the mind, the thinking process of a child must clearly differ from an adult. So what would you like to say about that?
Well, a part of growing up is developing the ability to think in more complex ways and think about more complex problems. So little children are just interested in when they're going to get their next feed, if they're going to be able to play, if they're tired, who's going to put them to bed, things like that. But very quickly, actually, children start, even 3 and 4-year-olds start to think about more complicated sort of things. And those of your viewers who've worked on farms will understand that children, even the age of 3 or so, start to understand how a farm works, what are the needs of animals, things of that sort. So you can actually see complicated thinking happening in children at quite a young age. And of course, once they get to school, not only are they growing up and experiencing more and starting to think about things in more complicated ways, but the school itself teaches them about more complex things like numbers and reading and things of that sort. And those kinds of developments, the starting to think about things in more complicated ways and solving more complicated problems, progresses quite quickly up until the middle of the teenage years. And at that stage, it continues to progress. In fact, people continue to sort of grow and think complicated things all the way through their lives. But from about the middle to late teenage years, the speed of that progress starts to slow down a bit.
You've been to Bhutan several times after your first visit in 2003. What were your initial thoughts about the youth of Bhutan then, and what do you think about the situation now?
Well, things have certainly changed a lot. The year that I came in 2003 was the first year that there were any mobile phones in Bhutan. At that stage, of course, they weren't smartphones, and there wasn't a distribution system across the country either. So it was only the main urban centres. So that was something that was really new, and Thimphu was a lot smaller. I remember there were paddy fields almost to the hospital, the referral hospital, whereas now there's 10 kilometres of apartments on the road out to Paro. So what that tells me is that there's been huge numbers of people coming into Thimphu, mostly, I guess, from rural areas, and you can start to see the effects of that now. There are a lot more young people around. There also seem to be a lot of young people who have time on their hands, a lot of young people who are into fashion and into having fun and leading their own lifestyle. 15 years ago, the young people were generally a lot more serious. They didn't sort of have the same sense of entitlement to have a phone, be in communication with the outside world, follow overseas or out-of-country fashions, all of that kind of thing. I mean, that had started because you'd had, I think in 1999 it was, multi-channel television came in through India. But even that hadn't reached a lot of the country. Technology, urbanisation, and what we call nuclearisation of the family, families becoming much smaller because you don't have a lot of relatives living with you, grandparents, uncles and aunts, cousins, that kind of thing. Those have been huge changes, and they've really changed the cultural landscape for children.
Talking about family and all, it is said that children are very great imitators, and how you speak to them becomes their inner voice. Mm-hmm. So to what extent do you think it is true?
Oh, children learn an enormous amount from their parents, good things and bad things. I mean, one example, in Australia, for instance, we know that of the children who smoke cigarettes, the majority of them come from families where their parents smoke, whereas in families where parents don't smoke, it's relatively rare for children to smoke. The same thing goes for alcohol use, for instance, and I presume it's probably the same for DOMA and things like that, although young people these days are a bit more conscious of their appearance and they're not so keen to have red teeth and things like that.
These days it seems that parents have this tendency to provide everything for their children. What do you think are the negative impacts on their life if their parents never say no to them?
Well, I think there's a couple of problems. If parents don't say no to children, and if they indulge them, with smartphones and things like that, children don't learn the value of money, for instance. These days, children spend a lot more of their spare time out of school playing. In fact, not very many, as far as I can see, have a lot of responsibility within the family. I don't think that parents are doing that deliberately. I think that parents have let that happen because they think that's the right way to do things. That the world is changing a lot. It's very important for their children to be up to date in many ways. Perhaps fashion is the one that they're least interested in from a parent's point of view, but technology is one where they think that they can help their children by giving their children technology. But what the children don't understand is that the technology, like a smartphone, for instance, may cost a month or even more of a parent's salary. The parent may have to borrow from relatives or somebody else, but the child doesn't get the message that the parent or whoever it is that the parent borrowed it from has had to put in a certain number of hours of work to get it. Parents think they're protecting their children from having to work too early or something of that sort. But I actually don't agree with that. I mean, one of the problems in Australia is exactly the same kind of indulgence, and that parents, the children who do better as adults are children who manage to fit some responsibility into their lives usually from sometime during primary school, and particularly during adolescence. And they're helping out in the home. They've got certain responsibilities that they have to do, and if they don't meet those responsibilities, then there's some reasonable consequence, like they can't go out with their friends on Friday or something of that sort. I think that parents are really trying hard to do the right thing for their children, but the problem for them is that they themselves don't understand a great deal about this new world, the technology and things like that. So they're struggling to work out what's the best way to help their child be a part of that world. And some parents actually do a very good job of it. I took a taxi into town the other day, and the taxi driver had one of the old model Nokia phones, the black ones, that didn't have a lot of any smart things really on it at all. And I was surprised because I'd hardly seen one of those phones in years here. And so I asked him why he had it. And he said that he thought that telephones were good for communication, and that was really all that he wanted to use it for. And so I asked him, what about his children? Did they want to have only use phones for communication? And he said no, they didn't, but he didn't think it was a good idea for them to be spending too much time on the internet and various other things that you can do on smartphones. So I thought that was really a sensible sort of decision. He sort of understood in his heart that that parents need to manage these new things that are happening in children's lives, and they don't have to just say yes to everything the children wants. And it's actually better for their children to say no sometimes.
Okay. When it comes to learning, I think in Australia there are various measures to assess and detect learning disabilities in children from an early age. Are there other procedures like that to detect other mental disabilities?
In Australia, when children start school, they go into a grade called kindergarten, which is basically the same as PP. And what happens in PP is two things, really. Firstly, the children get used to sitting in one spot all day, which is always a challenge for little children. And the second thing is that the teachers start to introduce them to learning and are thinking about whether or not this child is likely to have some difficulties in the learning area. And the sort of things that they can pick up even at that level is whether children are having difficulty learning numbers, or whether they're having difficulty learning how to write letters and write their own name. And another thing that they're looking out for is if children don't seem to be getting on so well with other children. They're either a bit aggressive, or they're shy and nervous around other children and things like that. So they're thinking about several things in this first year of school. If they think a child has got a difficulty in any of these areas, mainly in the learning area or the nervous or behaviour area, then at the end of the year they review all the children and they make some plans for the following year in year one. And so in the learning area, for instance, in year one, children who are struggling particularly with reading can go into a special class for a few hours several days a week to help speed up their reading. And the same thing if they're having trouble with numbers. And if they're having nervous problems, or there's problems with their behaviour, then the school counsellor might have a talk with them or their family, or they might just observe them for a little bit longer to see what's going on. So there's a process in place that tries to pick up these problems early and do something about them early, because sometimes children will just grow out of these things, but sometimes not, and it requires some kind of intervention to help them get back on a normal track.
Due to Bhutan's rapid development, they are being exposed to different changing cultures and trending electronics, and they are even exposed to harmful physical enhancement products. And children, I think, they are finding it difficult to find a balance in all of that. So how do you think people like their parents or the community or other people who are concerned about children or the children themselves, how can they help cope up with all the stress of the changing environment around them?
Probably the biggest thing that is changing has been media and entertainment technology. The change that brought was that it brought other cultures directly into people's homes. And people have told me that one of the things that they noticed was that very young children were not learning their local languages quickly. Though some of them were picking up Hindi and even English before they were picking up Zonka or Shashop or whatever was their local language, and that's not a good start. That causes some difficulties. And the other thing, of course, was that with older children, they were seeing different ways of dressing, different hairstyles, makeup, all that kind of thing. And they started to think naturally, of course, why can't I do that? So it changed people's hopes and wishes. And when that came in, parents needed to were finding themselves being asked to provide their children with things that they didn't have resources to do, or that they felt that children were expecting too much. And I guess that was the first time that they really had to start to learn to say no to some of these things. Parents found that difficult. Firstly, because they thought this is the modern world and we're depriving my child of a modern opportunity. And secondly, they often didn't actually understand the technology very well. And if people don't understand, a technology, they don't necessarily know how to manage it. How do they say no? Well, the short answer is you pull the plug out of the wall so the electricity goes off. So it's actually simple to say no and act no. But a lot of parents, even found that difficult. And of course, they also had got a lot of entertainment out of it themselves. It gave them a bit of a break. But again, the problem was working out how much is enough, and parents often didn't have a confidence about that. So they weren't confident enough to say, look, you haven't done your homework yet, so you can't watch television until after it's finished. Or if a child broke the rules about that, to say, well, look, I'm sorry, tomorrow no television. Or you've got to help your mother clean up after dinner. You've got to go get the water, or something of that sort. They sort of couldn't. A lot of parents struggled with that mix of the old doing things the old way and having old expectations, and having to deal with children wanting new things that the parents had never seen before themselves. Then with smartphones are really just a small computer. So you can get just about everything on a smartphone. There's telephone, internet. You can watch movies. You can play games. They're a very small, compact entertainment system. And what children got off multi-channel television, they got 100 times more off a mobile phone. And of course, using a mobile phone, there's a lot of being able to operate it and download apps and do all these sort of things. A lot of parents had absolutely no clue about that kind of thing. So again, they ran into the problem of, I don't understand how these things work. I don't understand all that my child is getting out of it. I have a bad feeling that they're misusing it a bit or a lot. But I don't know really what to do about it. And the answer is a very simple one. You can say no. You can say that's enough. If children break rules that you've got about it, you can take their phone for a day and they won't die. There'll be nothing devastating will happen, except the child will complain, of course, a lot. So parents have difficulty doing that. I think the good thing I understand about smartphones is that it has the potential to teach their children an enormous amount of things children need to know, how to use that technology, as well as all the content areas. The things they learn about the outside world, the ways in which it can help their homework, many, many, many things. And whatever workplace today's children go into in a few years' time, there's going to be a lot of technology there. So they need to know these things, but parents also need to have confidence that they can that they can control their child's usage of it in fair ways. They don't have to hit their children or use any of those old methods of punishing children. There are much more effective ways of getting children to behave according to the rules without having to sort of hit them or use any sort of physical punishment.
So you're suggesting that in order to make children become more responsible, you have to give them little responsibilities every day?
I think that it's important that children are still active members of the household, contributing to the household. Because school takes such a big amount of their time these days, they don't have as much time as they did. But they can help out with siblings, getting the smaller children ready for school. They can help out with cooking. They can help out with outside things that need to be done. There are many, many things, jobs that parents have in the home that the children are old enough to learn to do. These days the problem is getting 15-year-olds to take some responsibility within the home. For many parents, if they actually remember back to when they were children, when when they were 5 or 6, they were expected to do, things that grown-ups are capable of doing in the home. So there's no reason why their 15-year-old can't be expected to do somewhat more than that. And it also instills in or helps children feel feel good about themselves as a family member, feel that they're contributing, and particularly if there are responsibilities which they have every day. In a way, it introduces them to jobs in the workplace where you've got to turn up on time, you've got a job to do, and if you don't do it, there are consequences. Maybe you're leaving it fired if you don't do it. So it introduces them to the world of paid employment, as well as the fact, as I say, it leaves them feeling as if they're making a contribution to their family rather than just coming home, sleeping, eating, and going out and having fun with their friends.
Doctor, it seems that children are very playful and mischievous by nature. Sometimes they take things without permission or pretend to be sick or get angry. How can a parent tell if the child is just being playful or showing symptoms of a bigger problem?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because that's often very challenging for parents, working out how much is enough. As you say, all of those things come naturally to children, and most children do a little bit of all of them, particularly on the fun side of things. All children, hopefully, are able to spend a bit of time having fun. But, children do steal, and children do hit other children and things like that. The way to tell is how often it happens. So if it's a one-off thing, they've stolen once, the parent has said, well, because you've stolen, you've got to go to bed early, or because you've stolen, you have to help your mother, or something of that sort, as well as returning whatever was stolen. If it's just a one-off thing, or it happens extremely infrequently, then it's probably not a problem, particularly if parents feel that feel that whatever punishment they give to the children or consequence the children has is a fair one, and it seems to have had the effect of stopping the child from doing it. But if it's happening frequently, and if, for example, it's starting to happen in other places, not just at home, like at school or at friends' places or something like that, then that usually indicates that it's starting to be a problem and that you need to do something about it.
We have a question from one of our viewers. She's a mother. She says, I have a son who is the middle child. He has severe anxiety and suffers from stress every day. He couldn't express his pain initially, so we went to the doctors for physical checkups. Everything seemed to be fine, and recently he started opening up, so we have started seeking professional help. I want to seek your advice on how we can help him at home.
Anxiety in children is quite a common problem, particularly if children are stressed in some way. Sometimes there's family problems or something of that sort that can cause stress, but sometimes children just get anxious because there's trouble at school, or they're being picked on, or something of that sort. Often, I'm not surprised that he went to see a doctor for physical things first, because very often when children are quite anxious, they also complain about physical things. They complain about headaches, or they complain about stomach aches, or they haven't got a good appetite, or something of that sort. So it makes a lot of sense to take them to a doctor. They're also often very private about being anxious. In fact, sometimes parents don't even know a child is anxious because they haven't been shaking or expressing various fears. I'm scared to go to school, I feel scared if I go in the supermarket, or various other fears like that, or scared of ghosts, or someone's going to break into the house, or something like that, which are the sort of things children often say. So sometimes they even keep that sort of information from their parents, so it can take quite some time until the child, until the parents actually know that the child is nervous. Communicating with the child and finding out in their own words, what it is that they're worried about is obviously the first step that parents can do. And then the second step, once they know what it is that the child's nervous about, is to see whether those anxieties are things that anybody would be nervous about, or that most people would be nervous about, or whether actually what's happening is that the child is becoming fearful of things that most people wouldn't be scared about. And that's what happens in true anxiety. People are scared of things that most people wouldn't be scared of. Ordinary day-to-day kinds of things. At that stage, probably the most effective thing that the parents can do is get some advice, bring their child along to see somebody who can give them some advice about what's the best way to manage their anxiety. Anxiety is one of those things, particularly when children get into the teenage years, when counselling can be very helpful, because the child can talk about the way they're feeling, and they can be helped to think about the things they're nervous about, and they can be helped to challenge some of those things that they're nervous about. So starting off with the things that only make them a little bit nervous, try doing some of those things and see whether you can overcome the anxiety dealing with one of the small nervousnesses, and then build up to dealing with bigger ones. And in terms of the parents, the person who the child sees usually has some advice for the parents about some ways, particular ways of handling it at home as well. Not just simple comforting, but sometimes more detailed sort of things that parents do. But it's important to try to get some specific professional advice about it early on. Sometimes children with anxiety are given medications. Most people would know that there are medications that are supposed to settle anxiety. They're not very much good use with children and young people. In fact, they're not a lot of use with most people with anxiety. There are some people, adults with anxiety, where medications can be very helpful, but in most cases they're not much help, and there's a risk that you can get addicted to them. So generally a counselling approach with anxiety is best, where the counsellor talks both with the child and also with the parents, at least initially.
Doctor, you have been here for like 3-4 months.
Yes.
On this visit, and you have been to Bhutan several times before that. You must have met a lot of people in the hospital. So what advice would you like to give to the parents and children of Bhutan? Well,
Bhutan is changing incredibly fast. It's probably changing faster than any other country in the world for most people. We're saying about how quickly multi-channel television and mobile phones have come into the country. It took 50 years for all that technology to sort of move into Australian society. It's taken 15 years for some people and 5 or 10 years for other people here. So there's an enormous amount of change happening in Bhutan, and it's good. It's change which is potentially very, very good. I think that the biggest challenge for Bhutan is managing that change. And as I was saying before, I think that parents know in their heart what their children need. They know that some of these things are good, but they've also got a negative side to them. And the really important thing is that they've got the confidence to make judgments about those things in their own family, to say, look, this your smartphone is really good for this, this and this, but I don't want you using it in this way. And I mean, that's just one example of, in a sense, saying no. And if your children break those rules, they lose the mobile phone for a day or 2 days or whatever it happens to be, or a certain period of time. So I think managing that change is really important. And another thing is that's happened with urbanisation and families living in very different circumstances now to the way they did only a generation ago, living in a small building, like in apartments and things of that sort, is that family is still very important, and it's really, really critical that Bhutanese families don't lose those links with where the family came from and where various family members have been spread out around the country and into other countries. And of course, technology is a wonderful way to help keep that going with Skype and just ordinary telephone calls and internet and everything else. So, that's a good example of how the new technology can help one of the real strengths of Bhutan from not being eroded. Adults get stressed by all the change that's happening and uncertainty about jobs and things like that. And children get stressed as well. And the people who... sometimes family can be of great assistance in helping when family members are stressed, but sometimes people get so stressed by things that it's beyond the capacity of the family to manage it. So at that point, it's good to be able to turn to professionals. Unfortunately, when people get stressed and get nervous and don't seem to be coping terribly well with change, often the community thinks that they're mad or that they've got a mental illness or something of that sort, and they feel very negatively about them, and they sometimes humiliate them about that. So it makes it hard for people to go for help when they need it, particularly when there are people in Bhutan who can help. So it's really important that people don't let other people's negative views stop them from going for help. Most mental health professionals place a very high value on what we call confidentiality, but I think what most people would understand is privacy. So you go to see someone who's going to help you with a nervous problem or something like that, you should expect that they will keep the fact that you're seeing them and what you're seeing them about completely private. That's the attitude of professionals here in Bhutan. It's important that people understand that you can't control what people think about you, but they don't need to know things about you that you're entitled to keep private, including how you're feeling in some ways, whether you're seeing a professional about it, and what it is that you're talking with the professional about.